Welcome to Defy These Times, a podcast dedicated to the easy task of tackling the 21st century. It is a project born out of my conviction that doing so requires an interdisciplinary and intersectional approach to understanding our complex world. I'm your host Shareah, and in these episodes I bring you conversations at the intersection of politics, history, philosophy, culture, science, and all the fun stuff in between. The following episode was first published for monthly Patreon supporters. To become a monthly Patreon supporter, please head out to patreon.com/FireTheseTimes or check the website for other methods. You can become a supporter for as little as $1 a month. And if you cannot donate, you can still support this project by sharing with your friends and family and leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. The music of this podcast is by Tarabit. Here's the episode. So this is a conversation with Shareah Taleghani. She's the author of the book Readings in Syrian Prison Literature, The Poetics of Human Rights. She'll introduce herself in a bit, but before that I'll just give you some overview of what you can expect in this episode. So we obviously spoke about Syrian prison literature, some background, some context, some examples, the different genre of Syrian prison literature, and so on and so forth. We had a pretty broad conversation on human rights, the universality of human rights, how they're applied, how they're viewed, and how they're experienced by imprisoned peoples in Syria. We spoke about how censorship works in Syria, the concept of tanfis, the arbitrariness behind censorship in Syria and how that makes it more effective. We discussed sort of the history of human rights in the region and the history of how Arab critics, through literature mostly, have had a pretty deep understanding of human rights even before this sort of became more of a discourse in the rest of the world, or at least parts of the rest of the world, including in the West. We then discussed the link between Syrian prison literature and the 2011 revolution. And we discussed the problem of selective solidarity in large parts of the left, and how we can build at least a path towards global prison abolitionism, taking the examples of the US, of Iran, and of Syria. So that's it from me, folks. Thank you for listening, and take care.
My name is Shareah Taleghani. I'm an assistant professor and the director of the Middle East Studies program at Queen's College. My research area is modern Arabic literature and Middle Eastern cultural studies. And in my research, I've focused a lot on dissent and cultural production and human rights and how all those three things intersect. So
thanks a lot for doing this today. And we'll be primarily talking about your recent book, which is called Readings in Syrian Prison Literature, The Poetics of Human Rights. If it's okay with you, can you just kind of give us some background on the book? It's obviously about Syrian prison literature, but for those who don't know much, if it's okay to just kind of talk about it.
Okay, so I became interested in prison literature when I took a class at NYU as a graduate student with Ilyas Khouri. And we read different works of Arabic prison literature. And before that, I hadn't really thought about prison writing or prison literature as a category. And also in the process of that, a group of us came together to translate a collection of poetry by Faraj Bayrakdar, which is actually just going to come out. It's a translation project that we started in the early 2000s. We had trouble finding a publisher for it at the time, but it's just coming out now. So I sort of started learning about prison writing and prison literature through that class. And originally I was going to write my dissertation on an entirely different topic, but I became more and more interested in researching writings about prison, right? And at the same time, it was a period of time in the US in the post 9/11 era where there was increasing concern about the US's systemic human rights violations in the so-called war on terror. And so there was the emergence of a body of scholarship that's sort of loosely labeled literature and human rights, or the humanities and human rights, which really, that body of scholarship didn't exist prior to 9/11. It sort of came into being because scholars in the humanities were examining, I think, more closely the relationship of the academy to human rights, and also the fact that the US was systematically violating human rights was more public, right? It's not that there weren't human rights violations perpetrated by the US government prior to that, it was just more public, right? More openly public, and also more publicly debated, especially the debates about the use of torture, right? So I ended up in Syria. I was originally researching a different topic, but I switched over, and I got the chance to meet with different writers and ask them questions about, their writing and why they wrote. And I decided to focus on sort of bringing the study of literature, the study of writing about prison in conversation with this body of scholarship about literature and human rights. So I was really influenced by Joseph Slaughter's work, whose book I highly recommend, called Human Rights, Inc. That was a big sort of influence. But the works of literature by Syrian authors that I read were really the most inspirational, right? And I think what I tell students I work with now is, and I think the question I was asking myself then is, with each work of literature, right? Like, what are we learning from this work of literature? What does it teach us? And so the question that I started to frame it as is, what does this text teach us about humanity? What does it teach us about human rights? And that's how I sort of came to read the text the way in which I did, and that sort of built the topics of the book. So the book is based on my dissertation, but there's a lot more that it was massively revised, just because I had the time to read more works of literature, but also read more theory, read more critiques of human rights. So yeah, that's basically how it came into being.
As it happens, just because you mentioned 9/11, of course, I mean, we're recording this early October, and so we're just over 20 years since it happened. As it happened a couple of days ago, an article came out in the New York Times about one of the men in Guantanamo that they're still holding. And Abu Zubaydah is his name. He's Palestinian. The usual story, suspected of being Al-Qaeda and then vindicated, but he's still there. And the story is actually on, he was tortured over 60 times, waterboarded. And the story is that the justices, like the US Supreme Court justice, did not even know about it, despite the fact that there was a habeas petition directed at them that's been standing for 14 years now. So that's the story. I will link this in the description, obviously. And any listeners, I think, already know this by now, but all of the works that we mention, any of the names that we mention, when I re-listen to the episode, I will include them in the description and in the blog post. Okay, so the title already says a lot. I feel like the Poetics of Human Rights. And I guess the way I would ask you this question, if that's okay, if you can explain what that means, and it's sort of like follow-up question. Did Syrian prison literature give you a new understanding of human rights, if that makes sense?
Yeah. So that's a really good question. And I use the term poetics. I had trouble coming up with a title, like as we all do when we're trying to figure out things. But I use the word poetics because, number one, it indicates a kind of systematic study of a body of literature, but it also relates, the term poetics relates to the effects that texts produce. So part of what I was asking myself when I was reading these texts is, what effect do they have on the reader, right? What do they show the reader, right? And how, in terms of structure, not just content, but structure and form, right? How do they affect the reader in a way that is different from, for example, a human rights reportage? So a lot of what I do is sort of bring into comparison or conversation, right, these texts, some of which are very, they have a lot of formal experimentation with human rights reportage, kind of conventional human rights reportage, to see how they work differently. What do they show differently? What do these works of literature produce that is different? What do they generate that is different from sort of conventional human rights reportage? but also what gaps or fissures do they point to? What erasures exist in the text, right? What are the silences of the text, right? And I think that that's all part of poetics, right? And it's kind of an umbrella term that I use, in part because through the sort of body of scholarship I read in order to sort of come to this place of writing about prison literature and human rights discourse, is that human rights are constructed through narratives, right? Human rights claims are constructed through the stories that are produced by people who have had their rights violated, right? But human rights organizations and the conventions of international law require that they're told in a particular way. Whereas we have this body of literature produced by Syrian authors that is in some cases poetic, it's fictional, it's dramatic, some of it's non-fictional, but it's creative and it's artistic, right? And so I wanted to understand how particular works move readers differently, right? How they touch readers differently, if that makes sense.
And what are some of the authors that you get into? I've only engaged myself with, I mean, I've read Mustapha Khalifa's Shell, Al-Kawka, and Yassin Harsaleh's work as well. I will say that I will have Yassin on at some point on this podcast as well, probably early next year. He kindly already accepted, but I've been very slow because I need to prepare myself and ask the like useful questions. But yeah, so just some, if it's okay to kind of introduce that body of work, that literature, like who are they and what are some of their books?
So with respect to Syrian work, the first work of literature I read was Faraj Bayrakdar's poetry, right? I had read more Iraqi and Egyptian prison literature. So Faraj Bayrakdar also has a memoir called The Betrayals of Language and Silence, which is a really important memoir as well. The other sort of first texts that I read were short stories. And I was interested in the fact that of a particular generation, there were so many authors who chose to write short stories, like Ghassan al-Jaba'i and Ibrahim Somoil, right? Who both of their collections of short stories are very important. Jamil Hatman, right? But there were other short story collections that one of the questions I asked was, why choose the short story, right? Rather than a memoir, rather than a novel, rather than poetry. And then there are other novels like Hasiba Abdelrahman, Rosa, Yassin, Hassan, right? Mustapha Khalifa, of course, and Malek Daghestani, right? So I read all of those, and then there are memoirs. And one of the things, like I say in the intro, is it's impossible to write about all of these texts. There are so many important texts that people need to keep reading and writing about. There are memoirs, Ali Abu Dahan, right? Lebanese citizen detained in Syria, Heba Al-Dabbagh, right? And others. So, and I'm just naming a few texts, like the list goes on and on and on. And there's so much more that could be written about. But my focus, what I do is I focus on a limited set of texts, because you can't, I think if you wrote about everything, it would be a 3,000 page work. But there's still so much more that could be written about. And now there are all the texts that have been published post 2011. And that includes works published like Saraj, who was detained in the 80s and 90s, but he published it post 2011, right? And so there are works now being published for those detained in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. And then there's the next generation, right? Those detained during the revolution and war, right? It's a huge body of literature, huge. Right? And it needs to be studied. It needs to be studied intensively and comprehensively. So I feel like I just touched on a range of texts, and the way I came to those texts is somewhat arbitrary, right? Like I did research, right? I tried to, in Beirut and even in Damascus, I tried to find, everything published during a certain time period, but it's easy to miss texts, right? There's much more to be done, right? And there are a lot of other scholars and PhD students working on the topic right now, which is good.
Just was thinking while you were talking, I know that you wrote a piece in 2015. I just found it on Tadmor military prison. Breaking the Silence of Tadmor military prison is called. I was wondering, kind of like just maybe as a side question, but was that based on, or at least part of it, sorry, because I haven't read it, but was that based on, did the documentary Tadmor by Lokman Slim help you in that documentation, or did that come later?
The film came after. I wrote it earlier, and it focused on texts written prior to 2011.
Okay.
Right, because Tadmor allegedly was closed by the regime. They claimed to have closed it, although I've heard contradictory reports about that. So, and then it was reopened after the uprising. I don't even know if that's accurate, because again, the reports I've read have been they're contradictory. And ISIS allegedly destroyed the prison, but I've also heard from Monica Borgman actually that it wasn't destroyed, and I still don't know what's accurate.
Yeah, I've heard the same contradictory stuff. So Monica, for those who don't know, Monica Borgman and Lokman Slim were the founders or other founders of which is the best, I think. I mean, one of the biggest, almost active anyway, groups in Lebanon that like do like memory work. I use them a lot in my own PhD because I do memory studies, among other things. And unfortunately, as I suppose many people know by now, Lokman Slim was assassinated earlier this year. The family accuses Hezbollah. I'm fairly convinced it's Hezbollah too, but others would say allegedly, as I guess this would be the official way of doing so.
I'm fairly convinced it was Hezbollah also.
Yeah. I mean, my position on this is pretty clear because I've written a piece on it for L'Orient Le Jour as well, which I will link. But anyway, so all of these people that you read, they are writing this in a specific context that has its specificities, but also some universalities. And I suppose this is the value that I'm seeing in talking about Syrian prison literature as a genre, like as a genre of literature. Can you sort of reflect, if you can, or before doing that, can you sort of just give us some idea of what is the setting that they are actually writing in? I have done a number of episodes on Syria, and I would guess a number of listeners do know this, but I don't want to assume some of them may not know much. Can you sort of kind of give us some sense of the country that they're actually writing in, the prisons that they're actually writing in, and what they're reflecting on?
So just very, very briefly, many of the texts I write about were actually produced. They were written in prison, right? Sometimes under circumstances, for example, in Tadmor, very atrocious and harsh circumstances where detainees didn't have access to writing utensils and had to create, writing utensils and forms of paper, or used oral composition to compose and then memorize the texts, right, that were later written down. So in some cases, the texts were produced in very harsh conditions. The collection of poetry that we translated by Faraj Bayrakdar, he talks about this in the interview that's included with the collection. Just fashioning writing utensils from whatever products are available, right? Using and probably the sort of typical thing is to write on cigarette paper. In some cases, when these texts were finally recorded, they were smuggled out of prison. But in other cases, depending on the regime of the prison, right, when it was less harsh, writers were able to actually write while they were incarcerated with typical notebooks and pens or pencils. And in some cases, they're written after release, right? So it varies from text to text, right? How each text was produced. And that's one of the things that I learned, right? That I learned in the process of talking to people and studying these texts, and just asking where they came from or how they came to exist as texts, right? Each text has a story, right? And I think the story of how each text was produced and circulated in its final form is also important, right? It sometimes gets forgotten, but each text, along with the author, has taken a journey, right? We need to remember what that journey is, because of the very harsh circumstances in which some of them were produced, right? Yeah. I don't know if that's...
Yeah, and thanks a lot. You also you do spend a bit of time, I think, in the introduction, if I remember correctly, talking about how censorship actually works in Syria. And I think that was interesting because a lot of people, and I didn't entirely realize this before I read it, before I read your book, because I think a lot of people, when they think of censorship in a context like Syria, they think that it's basically constant and it's the same, like it's been the same model basically for the past 5 decades. And in fact, you mentioned how there is actually a very specific role that the regime, like a very specific regime tactic, let's say, centering the role of like arbitrariness and unpredictability. And there's even a term that's associated with this, like, which is tanfis. Can you sort of talk about this for those who don't know of how censorship does work in these contexts, and what is tanfis as well?
Sure. So I would say first that I actually write about it by drawing on the work of other scholars. So people who are especially interested in this should read Lisa Wedeen's book, Ambiguities of Domination, Rebecca Jubin's book on Syrian television drama, and also Miriam Cooke has written about it. Basically, and I think this is also, it's important to think about, right? The system of censorship is arbitrary, and I just talked about this with one of my classes about how arbitrariness is a characteristic of authoritarian regimes, right? Or at least this is what I learned by talking to authors, right? That things are not automatically censored, that, for example, the Ministry of Culture would allow something to be published, but then prevent its distribution. So there's that, right? Or occasionally allow something to be published and circulated because it was considered acceptable, right? It varies again from text to text. And one of the reasons why I became interested in this is just, I was actually in Damascus, I think this was 2004 or 2005, and I was in Abu Dhahan, and there was a book fair by the Ministry of Culture, and I was really surprised to see a collection of poetry by Faraj Bayrakdar being sold at a book fair that was sponsored by the Ministry of Culture. And it was a collection of poetry that he had composed in prison, right? So I think the arbitrariness is one factor, right? That people can never tell, right, what will be allowed and what will be prohibited. But the other part of it is the fact that people circumvent the system, right? And they were circumventing the system prior to digital publication, prior to people being able to put everything in a PDF and put it online. And now with digital publishing, the regime just can't control it, right? People circumvent the mechanisms of censorship everywhere. It's true in Syria, it's true in Iran, it's true in Egypt, right? So although the government, the regime tries this tactic of allowing a few things to be published, right? And this is part of tanfis, right? To, let off some steam, or have some form of licensed or commissioned criticism, people still circumvent that, right? They can't control, the regime cannot control what people produce and what people circulate. They can control what's sold at a Ministry of Culture book fair, right? But even, just from living and working and studying and traveling in the Middle East, it's amazing how many banned books you can find in bookstores, right? They're still there,
Yeah, I always tell this to a lot of people who are surprised, but I've never had that much difficulty finding Israeli books in Beirut bookshops. And I'm talking about novels or history books, like Ilan Pape's books are translated into Arabic and you can find them. And those are technically illegal in Lebanon, but they're there. There's definitely some parallel to Lebanon, although it's definitely worse in Syria. Lebanon is usually seen as, or likes to portray itself as, relatively more open-minded and liberal and etc. But censorship of movies, although I do know Elias Khoury has experienced this for that matter as well. Elias Khoury, for those who don't know, is a well-known Lebanese writer, pretty amazing guy. But in cinema, which is what I study, the censorship is often, it is always, okay, let me put it this way. It seems arbitrary, and it seems like the censors are sometimes censoring because they're having an off day, and sometimes they let things pass because they're fine with it or whatnot. Usually the censorship has to do with either sex or religion or politics. Those are the three things, all of the above. And you would have certain things.
It's the Trinity.
The Trinity. And you would have certain things like, I remember very well I watched World War Z in Lebanon, and something like 30 minutes of it was removed, but the rest remained, and you can still guess what the topic was, but they decided to remove 30 minutes of it. And there are other cases when it's actually Lebanese directors where the movie can either be censored or first allowed and then censored, like basically allowed to be screened once or twice, or heavily edited. I'm trying to remember, I forgot. There's a movie called The Kite, if I'm not mistaken, that like half of it was removed or something like this, and it ended up never actually being screened because of it. I think the director removed it. But so all of this happens. And when it comes to arbitrariness, I will mention a personal example. I mean, it's public by now, so it's fine. But when Lokman was assassinated, I had kind of publicly decided that I'm not going back to Lebanon. And the reason for that, which is open knowledge by now, like I have received death threats from Hezbollah in the past. And the arbitrariness of it is that I don't know whether I am still threatened right now or not. I don't know whether if I go back, whether they just don't care and they forgot about me, or whether suddenly they want to remind me that they do remember me. And it's this kind of you never knowing whether something bad whether there's going to be a concrete consequence for your action that can actually function as a very effective tool, maybe even more effective tool. Because one thing that happens if the government is always cracking down is people start developing resistance to it, patterns of resistance to it. We start understanding what can be done and what can't be done. We know we can't, like when we think of protests in Syria in 2011, I know this from like friends and activists and stuff, and what they knew, at least in the early days, they knew where they could and could not go. They knew how to organize themselves. They knew it changed a lot from place to place. I don't think it's very general, but some of them have mentioned that. And so I can easily imagine, or now I understand. I also used to think that censorship has to be quote unquote very effective in order to be, or has to be regular in order to be effective. But actually, if you make it irregular, it can be more effective. And I suppose that's what you find in the book as well.
Well, and I think what you're talking about, the arbitrariness and the not knowing, which is really destabilizing, right? Whether it's censorship or death threats, right? Which we know Hezbollah is common for doing. It's the not knowing that can produce forms of self-censorship, right? Even if they're subconscious, right? And that's one of the effects of it, right? Or it can be one of the effects of it unless people are very aware and conscious of it, which is difficult to do, right?
No, definitely. And Syria has always been more difficult than Lebanon, and it can already be difficult in Lebanon. So I can only imagine how it is in Syria. But this has, like, what we're calling prison literature has been going on for decades now. And you even, I think you mentioned, if I'm not mistaken, that one moment, sorry, like the first usage of the term adab al-sujun, so prison literature, came 3 years before the founding of the first human rights organization in Syria. I find that quite interesting. Do you think that sort of reveals something?
So I think that Arab critics, right? Arab critics connected literature and human rights well before US scholars did, right?
Yeah.
I think there was a consciousness of the relationship between detention for explicitly political reasons and violations of human rights decades ago, right? And there's a foundational study of prison literature by Nazih Abu Nidal called Adab al-Sujun, right? Where he starts off with a discussion of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, right? So this connection between writings about prison and human rights was made decades and decades earlier by Arab scholars, right? I think that also what is going on in the 1970s globally is that the language of human rights, because this is the time when Amnesty International gets more of a public, it comes more into international public awareness. I think that from the studies of the history of human rights I've read, in the 1970s globally, there's a greater awareness of the language of human rights. It takes a couple of decades, right? Because the UDHR was established in 1948, right? And then a few decades later, there's a kind of growing public awareness of notions of human rights. As problematic as the concept of universal human rights are, that's a whole nother discussion. But so we have, right, a Syrian scholar, writer, and critic writing about Adab al-Sujun in 1973. And I have to say that's the earliest I found in my research. I'm sure if people with access to greater access to archives might find something earlier. Right, and then this attempt to establish a human rights committee by the Syrian Lawyers Union, right, which of course was disbanded by the regime, right? So I think there's connections there, right? This awareness, and it's not just sort of that first foundational study of prison literature. It's critics writing in the 90s connect human rights and works of literature that deal with detention. That there's an awareness there. I mean, it's interesting to read like a literary critical study from the 1990s that starts off with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, right? Like that's how one particular scholar and critic opens the book, right? So those connections were made, and they were made by Arab critics well before this field sort of emerged in the US, right? The US context is specifically in the post 9/11 context. And I've been thinking about it more and more. I think it has to do with the fact that for decades, human rights violations in US consciousness, human rights violations were perpetrated elsewhere by others, right? And for a variety of, and we know this isn't true. We can just look at why the US needed a civil rights movement, right? It's a country founded on the violation of the rights of indigenous peoples and Africans who were enforced into slavery. but I'm talking about public consciousness of the US committing human rights violations. It really comes to the forefront post 9/11.
And on the question of universal human rights, you write, and here I'm quoting, the truth effects generated by works of prison literature coincide with, confirm, and challenge the truth claims produced by the documentary and generic conventions of human rights, end quote. Would it be fair to, so explain that a bit if that's okay, and would it be fair to say that Syrian prison literature, as you've studied it, contributes to this challenging of the universality aspect of human rights? And what does that mean? What does that mean?
So there's a couple of things. So first, all narratives produce effects of truth, whether they're fictional or non-fictional, right? We read something and we perceive the truth of it, whether it's a philosophical or factual truth, right? And that's not me. I'm getting that from reading a lot of genre theory. But when I was thinking about pairing human rights reportage, for example, with memoirs, right? Many of the memoirs document the conditions of prison. They document our, summary executions, for example. They document torture, right? In a way that is parallel to human rights reportage. And in some cases, these memoirs serve as testimonials and forms of witnessing when, for example, human rights activists couldn't get access, right? They're another form of testimonial or witnessing. But they also, when I say they challenge the generic conventions of human rights, there's a couple of ways that they do this. And number one is you'll find in particular works, right, that there's a lot of questioning and, forgive the term, interrogation of the possibility of representing the experience, right? How do you represent the experience of detention to really communicate what it is? How do you write about torture to explain what it is? There's a lot of sort of questioning and interrogation of the process of writing and the process of representing the experience itself within the literary works, where authors are directly, explicitly saying this can't be completely represented, right? And this can get into sort of the field of trauma studies, right? But also the human being, right, as an entity, as a thing, is constructed in a particular way in human rights discourse, in human rights reportage. And there are particular works of prison literature that depict the human in alternative ways. And in some cases, depict the human by representing something unhuman, right? I'm thinking of Ghassan al-Jaba'i's short stories, for example. So particular works of literature show us is that the transparency and legibility and readability of human rights reportage, right, can be sometimes called into question. It can point to the gaps in the representations of human rights violations in human rights discourse. It can function as alternative forms of testimonials, and it constructs the human differently, right? There's part of this is coming from critiques of legal discourse, right? The law constructs, right? Human rights are built through a system of international law and through specific forms of language, right? We just read, in my class, we just read the complaint and demand for jury trial of Maher Arrar, right? Who was the survivor of extraordinary rendition to Jordan and Syria, right? And there's a particular way in which his story is told, right? And then we looked at alternative forms of the way he tells his own story, right? And so part of it is thinking through what gets erased in the process of legal human rights claims, right? And also part of it is a concern, I think, that at times the way in which human rights claims are made, right? Is there a possibility that the way they're being told allows the authorities or entities who are supposed to respond, right, and do something about it? Does it allow them to ignore it, right? And that, I think, for me, has been a question as someone who sits in the US very comfortably in New York, right, and witnesses time and time again the international human rights system not intervene, right? In part because of the US government, right, sitting on the Security Council. So there's that. And then the concept of universality, that's also at issue, right? The Universal Declaration of Human Rights had, in its development, right, there were people involved in its development from across the globe. It's an aspirational declaration, right? It's never fully come into existence. It's never fully been implemented. It's aspirational. It's what is hoped for, right? But despite the fact that there were international voices, global voices involved in the creation, it is, it relies on the modern European legal system primarily, and is formulated out of that. So one of the things, and I don't know that I fully answer it in the book, but it's something for further exploration, is thinking about, by reading these artistic creative works, these works of literature, right? By reading them and the ways in which they tell stories, right? The ways in which they show humanity and inhumanity, the ways in which they show human beings, right? Can they help us sort of conceive of an alternative system of human rights, right? Now, that's very aspirational, and it sounds naive in some cases, but we know that the international human rights system isn't working as it was meant to work, right? Well, it's human rights activists in the region, who are the ones putting themselves on the line to document what's going on, know that the system sometimes fails, right? But my question is, if we look elsewhere, we look at other forms of cultural production, is it possible to conceive of an alternative system, and one that is more grassroots bound? That question isn't yet answered, but it's something I think it's important to think about, because, right, there's been recent scholarship, English language scholarship, that is, critiques of human rights, and they're very valid critiques. They're very, very valid critiques, right? That it's the end times of human rights, that the rights system should be disbanded, right? But that doesn't help people who are actively working through the system right now. There's no alternative. So can we conceive of an alternative that's more effective, that isn't tied to the Security Council, right? Because that's not just the issue of universality, but the fundamental flaw in the system is the authority and power is controlled by a few states, right? And that, we know the story there, right? That those states intervene in their own national interests to the detriment of different groups of people all around the globe, or they fail to intervene, right? That failure of intervention.
Yeah, for sure. And so a number of things. So quickly, you mentioned the story of Maher Arrar. I know him, and so for those who don't know, as you said, he was deported first to Jordan and then to Syria. in 2000, right after 9/11, like in 2002, I think. And he remained in Syria. He was imprisoned by the regime on behalf of the CIA. He was tortured for about a year, and he stayed in prison for about a year. And he's a Canadian citizen, which is relevant to the story. After his ordeal, he was released from Syria. The Syrian regime itself said that he's not a member of Al-Qaeda, and he returned to Canada. Canada officially apologized for its participation, etc., etc. But to this day, if I'm not mistaken, he still cannot go to the US. He still cannot travel to the US. And as of 2010, which is on Wikipedia, the last update I saw, the Supreme Court of the United States refused to review his case. And obviously, with that, let alone the fact that they obviously never officially apologized, the United States. So that's on Maher. I'm wondering, one thing that I've noticed kind of on this question of universality and support, in some way, like looking for alternatives to universality that are actually universal, if that makes sense. One thing that I've noticed, even on this podcast with some of the guests I've had, is that there are certain experiences and certain, I would even say maybe certain traumas, although I don't know if this can be confusing, that allow some people to feel empathy to other people in similar situations or similar enough situations. And here I think especially of there's when in 2016, in the end of 2016, when the Battle of Aleppo was happening and the fall of Eastern Aleppo and the siege and everything, there was a protest, at least one, maybe more than one, but there was at least one protest in Sarajevo with like over 1,000 people. And the people who were being interviewed included relatives of those murdered in the genocide in the 90s. And they were saying things like they know what it's like to be abandoned by, quote unquote, the international community. And this sense of abandonment creating a sense of shared experience between, well, in this case, Bosnia and Syria. I have seen it also in recent years with the treatments of Uyghurs in Xinjiang. I have seen some friends of even people I know, like Syrians and Bosnians, talking about not necessarily similarities in the sense of literally what is happening. It's usually not the direct it's usually not necessary for exact details to be replicated in Bosnia or Syria or whatever, but the sense of being abandoned ends up being the one that is shared. And I'm wondering if you have some thoughts on, I don't know, reading Syrian prison literature in general. Is it something that some of the writers reflect on having this universality, if that makes sense, that some of them know that they were writing an experience that isn't just relevant to them, but relevant to people elsewhere that are, let's say, in prison, for example, maybe something similar or something like that?
So I think that's a good question for the authors, unless they explicitly state it. But my sense is that it depends on the work, but my sense from my own readings is that there's an awareness, especially of the experience of how, I'm not sure how to put this, but like incarceration is a global phenomenon, right? I'm speaking to you from the capital of incarceration because the US imprisons the highest percentage of its population in the world. I'm about 10 miles from Rikers Island, which is New York's most notorious prison. There's an awareness of the fact that incarceration happens elsewhere, that political detention happens elsewhere. And I think you would have to ask the individual authors who their audience was in mind, who they think their audience is, right? Right, for me, especially as someone who teaches, right, and there's not a lot of Syrian prison literature available in translation, right? But I know that, for example, I've had students who have been incarcerated, right, and they really identify with even if it wasn't for explicitly political reasons, they really identify with what is being expressed in these works of literature, right? That imprisonment is a global form of punishment. There's that, but there's also the fact that many of the writers who I spoke to said that they had read works written by other authors, not just Arab authors, but Russian literature, right? Latin American literature. They had American prison literature. There's a huge amount of American prison literature that they had read, and they had read and experienced other works of literature. There's this connection between the texts, right? In that some of the experiences are shared, right? As a reader, I can see the connections. Whether or not the authors intended their works for a Syrian audience, an Arab audience, a Middle Eastern audience, a Western audience, a global audience, I think it depends on how the author feels, right? But that doesn't mean that those works don't get read elsewhere, right? They still circulate, and they can still have impact, right? They still have impact on broad and diverse audiences, right? I mean, I teach what's available in translation, and I see that, I see the impact that the texts have on students, whether they've been incarcerated or not. Very few of my students have experienced incarceration, but I've had a few, and they still have impact, right? Like the question of audience is a tough one, because any text can be read by a reader that it wasn't intended for, right? The author can't control that once it starts circulating.
Yeah, no, for sure. That's very interesting. I would be curious to hear more about people who have themselves gone through incarceration, regardless of whether it's comparable to the author that comparable in severity, let's say, to the author that they're reading. I would be interested to hear some of the thoughts on that. I wonder if it's. I have a couple of more questions before doing the book section, if that's okay.
Sure.
One, well, the question of the link between Syrian prison literature specifically and the revolution, the 2011 revolution. I believe that you write of that, like the Syrian prison literature kind of becoming one of the foundations for the revolution. I certainly know from a few friends in Daraya and I don't remember elsewhere, probably Damascus, but who knew of who participated as activists in 2011, who knew of Al-Kawkar, for example, who knew of the Shell, the book by Mustapha Khalifa. I believe Yassin Salah was mentioned a number of times as well. So definitely some people who participated also had this in mind, or had that literature in mind. But how would you explain the link between Syrian prison literature and the 2011 revolution?
So part of why I wrote that is in response to the US mainstream media coverage of the Arab uprisings. There was a tendency to sort of ignore the fact that there had been oppositional political movements in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Syria, elsewhere, to sort of erase the decades of activism and political opposition parties, and just talk about the now, and especially focus on youth and social media. And that's obviously a part of the 2010-2011 uprisings, but this kind of, and I think it's part of US ignorance about the history of the region as a whole, sort of the larger US public's ignorance of the history of the region as a whole, that, these oppositional movements, whether they're Islamist or Marxist or other leftist, right, that they have existed for decades, right? So that's part of why I write about that. But my sense is that these works of literature, right, or the essays or other writings that formerly imprisoned authors have produced, right, they're part of the consciousness, right? is it always direct? No, but it's part of the backstory, right? Part of the foundational backstory. And Rita Sakr has a book called Anticipating the Arab Uprisings, where she talks about works of prison literature. She focuses on 3 works post 2005 in Syria. As part, she calls it part of the political geography of the Arab uprisings. So one of the things that I think it's important is to, and I hope, you know, other scholars will sort of look at this more closely, because at least in English, there really isn't that much writing. For example, there isn't much scholarship, right, about the Syrian opposition. There's been some about cultural production, but not about the Syrian opposition. That they'll look to, that they'll start examining sort of the history of opposition more to understand that as part of the backstory of the uprisings. And I'm talking about like English language scholarship, not Arabic scholarship, obviously, because that's a whole, you know, different.
Yeah.
But part of it is this, and my colleague Alexa Farad and I worked on an edited volume about dissent, and part of that edited volume about dissent was in response to this, right? That the coverage of the uprisings in 2011, the mainstream media coverage, even some of the progressive media coverage, was problematic in that it ignored this whole history, right? This very complicated, long history of political opposition, right? Or, you know, or just didn't make any connections between it.
Yeah, it's actually linked also to the next, like to the last question, which is on, like, you dedicate the book to the detainees and those forcibly disappeared in Syria, in Iran, and in the US. I find putting the three those specific 3 countries quite interesting together, putting them together quite interesting, because it brings up important points, like I feel which has pretty deep, even radical like potential. The way I've framed it in my mind is that, like, the way discourse around these 3 countries often goes depends a lot on, if we're talking about like from like Americans, let's say, often depends on one's own political, I don't know if I would say preferences at the local level. So by which I mean, if it is like a mainstream discourse, as you mentioned, it could be like, okay, well, they're generally in favor, but very kind of like of the protests in 2011, but like at the surface level, usually not digging too deep, not sort of going to the context, not sort of going to the background. And yeah, kind of, you know, as we remember in 2011, and I saw a repeat of that in 2019 in Lebanon, like the uprising being called like the WhatsApp revolution, stuff like that.
Yeah.
And in obviously 2011, it was like Facebook and Twitter, back when people thought Facebook was a force for good. And I think that it's very interesting because I also know of, I'm not going to name names, of course, but I know of a certain tendency in the US among people on the left, for example, to either downplay the what prisoners, even prison industrial complex in Iran or Syria, for example, to name those 2. And obviously the 2 are linked just by the fact that Iran intervened in Syria and is a big part of why the regime survived. And I mean, the Lebanon angle is another one altogether as well. So I am very interested in seeing the potential of, for example, reading this book, and a book that's on Syrian prison literature, written by yourself and dedicated to the detainees and prisoners and those forcibly disappeared in the US, Iran, and Syria, because I can easily imagine, and I have read, like if I go on even Iranian, I don't go, but if I read Iranian press TV, for example, state media, opposing, you know, saying it's horrible what happens in American prisons, but obviously nothing of what happens in Syrian and Iranian prison. And I probably would see the same on Syrian state media saying the same about America, but not about Iran, and obviously not about Syria. In America, we sort of see similar things. Obviously, it's a bit different. It's not as repressive in the same way, but we do see certain norms being reinforced in people who, for example, who are comfortable talking about the prisons or talking about the abuses of the governments in Syria and Iran, but not in the US, or who are actually very concerned about, let's say, prison abolitionism in the US, as one should be. But when the question comes of what happens elsewhere, that's when it can get a bit messy. And so this whole concept of the universality of something, of like, basically we should be, if we are prison abolitionists, we should be abolitionists about that in Syria and Iran and the US, essentially. I'm curious about your thoughts on this. Yeah, sorry.
So I have very strong feelings about this, and have posted on Facebook my very strong feelings when it comes up. The dedication to detainees in Syria, Iran, and the US is partially from my personal history. It's also my awareness of the problematic politics of being an Iranian American writing about Syria at the time when the Iranian regime is one of the key components in buttressing the Assad regime, right? Yeah. And also, the book is about Syria, but I'm also very critical of the Iranian regime. I have lots of opinions on that we can talk about another time. But what you're referring to, I think, is there's a very problematic pocket in what's sort of generally referred to as the left in the US. And the left in the US is actually not that very left, right? Elsewhere it would be sort of middle of the ground, right? There's a very problematic pocket on the left among progressives, right? And liberals, right? That tacitly, complicitly, or even directly supports both the Assad regime and the IRI, right? And in some cases, they valorize the regimes, right? As arguing that they're anti-imperial, right? And there have been some journalists and commentators who have done this, and it's really problematic, right? And my stance that I've tried to communicate over and over again, and I have many colleagues who share this stance, is that, it is important that we remain critical. If you're an American citizen, which I am, right, and I'm based in the US, right, it's important to remain critical of the US government, which I am, right? But it's equally important not to complicitly support, right, authoritarian regimes that are, oppressing people who are sometimes very courageously attempting to struggle for their political freedoms. And it's important to instead stand in solidarity with them, right? And part of the problem is this pocket on the left that supports the Assad regime and is sometimes pro-Putin, right? And also supports the Iranian regime as well, right? There's a strain of Orientalism in it, right? That comes out in their writings that they don't even see themselves, and they need to be called out on it, right? And I became aware of this because I was involved in the protests against the invasion of Iraq, right? And I got involved in a local peace group, I was living in Staten Island at the time, which is a really conservative area of New York. It's the only area that voted for Bush, right? But there was a peace activist group. But people would make really problematic comments, okay? That people in the region were just, quote unquote, accustomed to dictatorships, right? That it's cultural. And I'm like, no, 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 no. Right. And that's what I mean by the strain of Orientalism or neo-Orientalism that feeds through some of these commentaries. And we've seen it with Syria. We've seen it, for example, when Qasem Soleimani was killed, there was almost like, I remember I posted on Facebook because I was really pissed off because I was getting commentary in my feed that was really valorizing him. And I'm like, no, 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 right? You can critique the US government, and you can critique the US government for effectively assassinating him, right? Extrajudicially, just taking him out, right? But you can also critique, right, his role in Syria committing atrocities against Syrian and other citizens, right? Like it's not one or the other, right? And people should have consistent stances, right? If you support struggles for freedom, right, you should support it across the board, regardless of who the actors are, right? Like it's one of my, I'll call it it's one of those things. It's a trigger or something because I've seen it. I've seen it in commentary on social media since 2011, but it was happening in 2003 before the US invasion of Iraq. Like when celebrities or liberal politicians go to, visit the regimes to show solidarity, right? You can be against problematic US intervention, but also against the same regimes, right? It is possible.
Yeah. I always find it interesting because I've had a number of guests on as well, and there's always this almost like a timeline of when they started becoming aware of these pockets, as you call them. And often, like 2003 is definitely an extremely common one around that time, around after that, more or less. And then if it's not them, it could be, if it's not that, it could be after 2011. But it's actually been interesting to me, or revealing anyway, that some, I've in recent years, I've been becoming more connected with some of the Bosnian circles, and some of them have been said that they actually saw this even in the 90s, which obviously I didn't know anything about. So it is very interesting. I've definitely dealt with those tendencies for a long time, and I think it's always, I guess I've got to the point where, well, it's still definitely a trigger, but I try and do something constructive with that trigger, which I didn't used to do before. Before it was just, ranting online and blocking and stuff like that.
I'm not an activist. I'm a teacher and a scholar and a translator, but I do participate in protests and things like that, and I have students who are very activist. And I think that, and I've also heard this from my students, especially I have a lot of students who are originally from the region, right? Either they're Arab or Iranian American, or they're, they've come as international students. And the most important thing is to confront it when you encounter it, right? Because oftentimes what I've found is people don't really, their intentions are good. They don't understand why it's problematic. Their intentions are good, right? They think they're doing the right or saying the right thing. But when they slip into Orientalist and racist discourse, right, that has to be called out on. You have to call it out. And I think that also being in Syria in 2003, 2004, 2005, it also shifted my perspective. I used to be completely against any form of US intervention, but I think there are times when international intervention has to happen, but it has to be a consensus and an international one. When the US goes on its own, it usually screws things up worse, basically.
Yeah, no, I agree with that as well. And yeah, also on like the engaging with problematic narratives, I also completely agree with that. I think it's important for people, and I say this because I know some listeners are among those people, to know how to pick one's battles and prioritize one's battles. Like sometimes we are dealing with online trolls and basically bullies, and it's not necessarily worth the time it would require to convince that person otherwise, because usually they don't enter this discourse or this conversation with the intention of having their opinions changed, let's say. But as you said, a lot of other people, I have known people who did have those views early on and then sort of changed because they learned more or they read more. Usually it's like they started having some kind of interaction with someone, either like a Syrian refugee maybe, or something along those lines. So yeah, that's what I would say on that. So I don't know if you have any kind of like other final reflections before we get into the book section. Feel free, or else I'll just go into the book section.
No, I mean, I hope that people continue to study and read works of Syrian prison literature. I know that people are continuing to study and read, and I hope that more works get translated so that they can reach an American audience, right? I think if more people in the US read such works, they would have a better understanding. Yeah,
for sure. All right, well, what are 3 books that you would recommend to listeners, and why those 3 books?
So I would recommend Mustapha Khalifa's The Shell, right, as the first novel about Tadmor military prison. It's a very important work, and it is. I'm going to recommend things that are translated. It's a very important work, and the story is told in a unique way. It's structured in a unique way as a kind of oral composition, and it's a very graphic but powerful novel. I'm reading it with my class next week, actually. The other book that I would recommend is Faraj Bayrakdar's A Dove in Free Flight, which is a collection of poetry that he wrote in prison that is coming out just now from Upset Press. And there's a very lengthy interview with him that was conducted in 2005 that talks about his experience with detention and with poetry, actually. Third book, I don't know if I should recommend something Syrian or something on human rights or prison.
You can do both. The 3 books rule is not a strict one.
When I originally started my research, I started reading about American prison literature, and then I stopped, right? I was really focused on stuff produced in works and criticism produced in the Arab world. And then in the past few years, I've come back to it. And I think a really important work, not just for the American context, but to think about prison writing globally, is Dylan Rodriguez's Forced Passages. I found it to be really impactful for thinking about why categorizing. So Dylan Rodriguez's book made me think more about the differences in context between American prison writing and how it gets marketed and packaged for a particular liberal audience, and Arabic adab as-sijun, and how that generic category was generated in a different context, but also because it has made me think more about the connections between those who are incarcerated, whether it's for explicitly political reasons or not, those incarcerated in the US to those incarcerated elsewhere, and also think about the possibility of a global abolitionist movement, right? Even though it seems very far from happening, what would that look like? So I learned a lot by reading it, so I highly recommend it.
Amazing. Thanks a lot for those. Well, that's all for me. Thanks a lot for your time. This has really been informative, and I'm sure listeners.
Thank you for having me.
Agree. The Fire These Times is made possible by supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to support through a monthly donation, you can head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes. And if you want to explore other options, you can do so by checking out the website.